So knowing we are on a very tight schedule, both from the perspective of Commissioner McGuinness, who has a firm stop at 6 o'clock, and also for Madame Sander, I suggest we get started without further ado. So on behalf of Paul Mesters, the president of the European Sugar Manufacturers Association, CEFS, and on behalf of Marie-Christine Ribera, CEFS Director General, I very much welcome you to this webinar on taxonomy, reconciling the virtual and the real economy. Just a couple of practicalities as usual. I see it's been the case for everyone so far. Please keep yourself on mute so we avoid any echoing or any interference during the speeches of the different speakers. And of course, feel free to put your questions in the chat. We will hopefully take some time to look at those questions and address them in the course of the webinar. And if not the case, we will for sure take note of those questions and reference, and of course, to Commissioner McGuinness and her team or other speakers as required for consideration. Needless to say, also looking at the number of registrations, that the topic at hand is a topic that is of key importance and has a key impact on many sectors, and because I think we have over 200 people registering from very different backgrounds, from very different sectors, indicating the very transversal discussions and nature of this particular file, and I think it's very interesting. Again, Madame Sander, would like to warmly thank you for attributing your support and your patronage to this webinar, and I will shortly give you the floor. And of course, a very big thank you for Commissioner McGuinness as well for making time available in your calendar to have a discussion with the people joining here, and of course to share your views on the future of the taxonomy and notably the development of the delegated act we currently have on the table. Madame Sander, je vous passe la parole. À vous la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Good afternoon to everyone, dear participants, dear colleagues, dear commissioner, and of course, dear Mayorette. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome you to this online webinar on the taxonomy to discuss about a proper balance between virtual and real economy. To begin, I would like to warmly thank Commissioner McGuinness for being here today to explain us the Commission work. Your presence is very precious for all of us. Thank you to the CEFS for the organization of the webinar, and also to Mr. Pesonen for his presence, as well as we all know how much some agriculture sectors are fully concerned. As you know, in the upcoming months, the Commission will finalize the draft delegated act on taxonomy in order to enhance sustainable investments. This act is essential. It will establish the criteria for determining whether an activity contributes to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Today, it's time to give ourselves the necessary means to achieve a more sustainable and carbon neutral Europe. In order to do so, we will have to be aware of all solutions that could offer environmental advances. This issue is very important for many of our sectors, and the number of responses received for the public consultation has expressed the concerns of many European citizens. The Commission has received, you will tell it to us, Myred, more than 46,000 responses. It will be a real labor of Hercule in order to take into account all these contributions. Because the Commission has to take into account all the concerns of involved sectors, it will be crucial for the success of the taxonomy implementation that we keep in mind the necessity to encourage. Taxonomy should be a compass and not a punishment. The Green Deal ideology is to not leave anyone by the wayside. And it should also be the case here. Many sectors could lead us to sustainable and innovative solutions for a more neutral carbon Europe. We should keep them on board and encourage them to do their best. Our agriculture, our producers are key players and allies in our fight against climate change. Wood, biogas, and biofuel, all these sectors offer opportunities that will need to achieve our ambitious goals. And we cannot take the risk to exclude some solution-oriented sectors. This could be detrimental to investments in this area and more generally to the achievement of the objective of the Green Deal. The risk of neglecting practical, realistic, and value-added solutions for our European agriculture and forestry sector is a real one, and a questioning of the sustainable nature of such investment risk, penalizing projects that are nevertheless promising. So it is really a crucial moment to demonstrate that the Green Deal is a real sustainable growth plan. This is why one of the most important requirements in the delegated act is technology neutrality and transparency. So we need to work all together to encourage and to stimulate new opportunities. So now I will let the floor to the other participants. I have to say I'm a little bit sorry because I think I will have to leave a few minutes before the end, but just a few minutes. And however, I would like to thank you all once again for your presence, and especially we are very happy to hear our commissioner, my ex-colleague, Mrs McGuinness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madame Sander, for those introductory statements. Of course, I very gladly will give the floor to Commissioner McGuinness. I think the participants in this webinar have been following the developments on taxonomy quite closely, and certainly with the arrival of the Delegated Act, notably, a file you've inherited, of course, when taking office as Commissioner in charge. And I think we'd very much appreciate your views on the future evolution of the file, Taxonomy, the Delegated Act, in terms of content, in terms also of timing, of course, in the weeks and months to come, the further involvement of stakeholders and the possibilities, of course, of making further modifications to the Delegated Act in question. I just take the benefit of inviting all participants to put any questions you may already have in the chat whilst we listen to you. Commissioner McGuinness, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, and indeed former colleagues. And I was really thrilled to be invited to take part in this evening's really important event. I have great respect and friendship for Anne Sander, and I think Anne has already set the scene for where we are at today. And I hope that my contribution and indeed our conversation will help allay some of the concerns, but also make us realize the challenge and the opportunities that we face as we move towards a more sustainable economy. I quite like the title of this evening's discussion, Taxonomy, Reconciling Virtual and Real Economy. And you know, because of COVID, this virtual world is partly our new reality. So in a way, when we talk about taxonomy, we do have to put it into its context, its proper context, and where it fits into the overall architecture of a, if you like, a rebooting, a reorientation of our entire societies and our economy. And of course, that is an enormous challenge, and it brings with it concerns from many different stakeholders. So this evening, I will both listen and contribute. I think the truth is that the real economy of today will not solve the major challenges of our time. So if we stay the way we are, climate change, environmental degradation, and indeed biodiversity loss will continue. And none of us want that to happen. And indeed, there are other social and governance issues which we also will need to face within the not too distant future. As Anne has already said, the EU taxonomy has drawn significant public interest. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to listen to the sector this evening. The numbers in terms of participation in our feedback are quite significant, and therefore we have rightly, in my view, delayed immediate publication. We need to listen and take on board some of those concerns, address them where that is possible, or at least explain where we come from within the frame of keeping the taxonomy science-based and also future-oriented. And I think that's one of the issues we may talk about as we go to our question and answer session. What's interesting since the COVID-19 pandemic is that there are very few people saying we should ignore the European Green Deal. We should just recover our economies and come back to where we were, a status quo recovery. I think everybody realizes, and maybe because of COVID, that it is time to change, to reorientate, to deliver on our words. And we need to deliver on our words through action and through finance. So a lot of the work here, which I'm now driving, is around making sure that the financial system addresses the new real world that we need to shape with large investments towards sustainability. And we do want it to be a green growth strategy, creating jobs and delivering growth and employment. Sustainable finance is a key part of all of this because we know that a significant amount of investments will be needed to fund this reorientation towards sustainability. And, you know, the word destination has been mentioned, and clearly the destination of the European Union and all of the stakeholders who have signed up to the Paris Agreement is to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And we have higher targets for 2030, which will be enshrined in legislation. So the need to act is immediate rather than a lot of time, if you like. So we need to start moving towards more sustainability, and we have to measure that, and we have to give guidance as to what that actually means in real time for particular sectors. So a central piece of our sustainable finance policy is the taxonomy, which went through the European Parliament when I was still a member. The regulation was voted through. And what the taxonomy is a guide to investments that are, if you like, economically and environmentally sustainable. When we look at all these responses, there are many and varied, some wanting us to go further, many wanting us not to dilute the science, and clearly others like the land use sector raising some concerns. Because of all this feedback, as I've mentioned, there will be a delay and there is time for us to, and what we are doing in our work here is dealing with the sectors where there's less concern, and then we move to those where there are deeper concerns to try and address some of those while sticking to the core principles of the science. Maybe I should spend a little bit of time talking about what the taxonomy is and the rationale behind it, and maybe also to say what it is not, because I think some of the concerns come from perhaps a misunderstanding about what the taxonomy is and why we have it in place. Firstly, it's a transparency tool, which translates the ambitious targets that I've referenced in our European Green Deal into what needs to be done at the level of economic activities, so every sector in our economy. It defines what is ultimately in line with our 2050 climate neutrality and other Green Deal targets, and it defines what activities make also a substantial contribution to these goals. So it's meant to provide, if you like, a gold standard for green activities. I've mentioned several times that it is science-based. We want it to be credible. We want it to be a usable tool so that we all know what counts as being sustainable or green. But I want to make it very clear that it is not a mandatory list of activities that investors have to invest in, nor a mandatory set of new performance requirements for the sectors it covers. In fact, to succeed, the taxonomy needs to go further than many existing sectoral policies today. The taxonomy should contain high standards and criteria because we cannot have business as usual to meet our objectives that I have just mentioned. So this status quo, if you like, won't do it. And it's the reason we have actually a climate crisis is because of the status quo and current policies. So if the taxonomy is this guide, and its only legally constraining element is to require disclosures for the market about how the activities of large companies and financial market participants align with the taxonomy. So in a sense, when we talk about the farm sector, this taxonomy does not mandate all farmers to get on board and to report and do all of those things. It will apply perhaps to some very large farming entities who may want to be fully on board in order for them to reorientate their activities, or they may already be taxonomy compliant, but it is not for everyone. And I have heard concerns about small farmers being worried about the taxonomy, and I think these concerns need to be explained, because this is not where the taxonomy is aimed at. It will allow choices for investors and companies about investments, and this will be, the market will decide when they have the information as to how they will react to the information provided. And we do understand that while the rules aren't directly applicable to others, there may well be over time market forces asking particular actors to give information on how they measure up to the taxonomy. So I see the taxonomy not as a moment in time, but perhaps as a work in progress. And we will also be mindful that research innovation may well change some of the criteria. So we have to be open to new science and new developments. So it's not a static and fixed, if you like, document that cannot be changed. There are concerns, which I have addressed to other stakeholders, that perhaps finance might be denied for those sectors that are not taxonomy compliant. In my view, that is not likely, and let me explain why. Firstly, those that are taxonomy compliant and want finance will be able to go and get finance as they wish. But for us in the Commission, and I think for the Parliament and for policymakers, the real change in our economies will come from those sectors in transition. So it's really vital that we don't starve those sectors from access to finance. And in fact, what we want to make sure is that we can finance those sectors that are transitioning to more sustainability. They are the entities and activities that will need the finance, and we will need them to get finance so that they can deliver on what we are asking from them. And as I say, this is where we will make those big climate and environmental gains. So it's really important that we deal with transitional finance. And one of the issues I've asked the Platform on Sustainable Finance to look at again is this whole area of how do we finance the transition? How do we make sure that this money is available to companies, rather than the concern that some have today that they might not have access to finance? And I suppose the taxonomy is a combination of hard disclosure requirements for some, and as I've said, particularly large companies, and maybe a soft incentive to others, perhaps over time, who see a value in being part of this whole taxonomy. It is proportionate, in my view, to this very big task we have at hand to help, to help mobilize investments to finance the transition away from environmentally harmful practices towards more sustainable and resilient activities. And it challenges companies to take sustainability seriously. Let me then focus on our area this evening: agriculture, forestry, the land use sector. Small farmers and forest owners are neither obliged to comply with the taxonomy criteria nor to disclose how they perform in relation to the criteria. And I think we need to say that often and clearly, so that we don't have a sector of our society anxious about something that is not impacting on them. Now, that said, some may see an advantage if they want and are able to provide information as to how they measure up to the taxonomy. So we're not excluding, but we're not mandatory requiring the small landowners to take part. The role of sustainable agriculture and forestry in the transition is recognized in the taxonomy. There's considerable flexibility for operators in how the criteria can be met, recognizing climate variations and in line with existing best national practices. But if the taxonomy criteria simply mirror the enhanced conditionality criteria under the CAP, of which I'm familiar, then virtually all EU farmers will be considered taxonomy compliant. And that would go against the taxonomy's objective to recognize, I suppose, a step forward when it comes to delivery, not just compliance with existing law. And this is one of the difficulties perhaps in our understanding. We have been several times asked, why are you going beyond existing EU law? And the very clear answer to that is because existing EU law in some areas is not sufficient to deliver on the big objectives which have been agreed politically by our leaders, by Parliament, etc. So we are already looking within the Commission at how we make some of our legislation more compliant. So there will be that step up, if you like, about a step towards this 55% target. So fit for 55 is something we will hear more about. However, there is, in my view, close alignment between the taxonomy and the Common Agricultural Policy. For example, 3 of the 9 specific objectives of the new CAP concern climate and environment. And the essential management practices in the draft taxonomy screening criteria reflect the objectives in the CAP's new green architecture. Essential management practices such as protection of carbon-rich soils highlight the mitigation potential of the sector. So farmers could benefit from CAP support, such as through eco-schemes or rural development measures, to implement some of the practices that are listed in the taxonomy criteria. Advisory services supported by the CAP could also help farmers improve their climate and environmental performance, which could facilitate access to the taxonomy if that were required. And I think at this point, and perhaps Pekka may well lift this point, a lot of farmers across Europe are doing a great deal around climate already. They are looking at the available science and technology, they're taking the advice, and they're working on reducing fertilizer use, on land management practices that are good for the climate. And I think we need to say that loud and clear, rather than suggesting that the agriculture sector is unwilling to change, has not delivered, because in my experience, it is doing a great deal. And we perhaps need to hear more about the positive work that is going on at farm level across our member states to achieve these climate targets. Because at the end of the day, a sustainable agriculture, a high quality soil, these are the core of our food production systems. And I think we all understand that, particularly those of us who are on this call. But in general, farmers, have become very aware over time, and I think this will increase, indeed, with or without the taxonomy. This has been happening. I'd also note that the CAP legal proposal doesn't contain any rules that taxonomy criteria should or must be used, and CAP payments will not be affected. It is a work in progress, the taxonomy. Of course, we're immediately dealing with the 2 delegated acts, and we are striving to have it in place by April. And not everything which is not included is unsustainable. So let me be very clear. And I mentioned that the taxonomy is a work in progress, and it will be expanded and updated as technologies, innovations, and policy evolves. We've recently, as I said earlier, asked how we could fund the transition. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from our platform on sustainable finance about this really key aspect of delivering on the European Green Deal targets. And I think we all understand that very well. And we know the need to finance and to have access to finance is absolutely key in order for us to have that delivery. But the taxonomy is only one part of an overall sustainable finance agenda. And can I say that when I moved from Parliament to FISMA, or this DG which looks after financial issues, perhaps I didn't fully understand that this area of the Commission will be driving the climate and environmental agenda. And I think that is hugely significant. Normally these issues are with DG Klima and Environment, but in fact, the work we do here, the services, is very much at the core of delivering on our targets. So I think it is quite interesting to see that evolution. It matches what's happening in the marketplace, where investors, companies, banks, financial institutions are talking about sustainability. And in my view, probably doing more on it in these last months than has happened over a number of years. We will have other issues around sustainable finance. So an updated non-financial reporting directive that will come forward in the coming months. And this will strengthen the ESG disclosures of corporates, including the development of potential mandatory sustainability reporting standards. So we're still looking at this area and working with stakeholders to see how that can evolve and how it can work more effectively. We're also proposing ESG sustainability related amendments to rules on fiduciary duties and top-up requirements to sustainability test in financial and insurance advice. So it is quite a deep dive into these topics. In addition, a green bond standard and an EU eco-label for green financial services are part of our work stream to create voluntary and credible labels for financial products based on the taxonomy. And finally, to match the European Union's increased 2030 and 2050 targets, which I've already discussed, we'll also unveil a renewed sustainable finance strategy in the summer months. And this will further explore how to empower companies to transition to sustainable activities and unlock the private funds needed to facilitate this green transition. This agenda needs to happen across borders as well. We need to discuss with our international partners how to harness the private sector to better face our joint responsibilities and ensure a more sustainable future. I think it's also important that if Europe is leading, which we believe we are, that we look to what's happening at the international level around sustainable finance initiatives. We are co-chairs of the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, and this is a very big undertaking covering a great part of the global population emissions and GDP. And here we would like to perhaps go further than some of the global standards, but also incorporate them into our work. So ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, we in the European Union have set ourselves a destination, a very ambitious target to reach climate neutrality by 2050, equally to halt biodiversity loss, to address environmental degradation. And we know that if we continue to do what we're doing today, we're not going to get there. So I always say to gatherings that, look, we know the destination, we now have to decide the path. Is it the path of least resistance? Is it a path that takes many twists and turns? Whatever the path is, we only have a fixed amount of time in which to work. And therefore, for me, it's really important that I get all sectors on board, that we do not cause undue concern and anxiety in particular sectors, that we understand where you are coming from, and equally that we push for progress. Because as I say, if we just accept how we are today, then we will not make progress. The taxonomy shows us the way. It provides a guide to economic activities that make this substantial contribution to our goals. And that's why many existing activities aren't aligned with the taxonomy currently. But a fair and just transition is also a key part of this road, this path towards 2050, because we do not want to leave people behind. We do not want to leave sectors of our economy behind. Businesses, including farmers and foresters, need to be able to invest in the transition to sustainability. And more importantly, I believe that the land use sector needs to understand that it has an enormous capacity to be such an enabler of change, to do a huge amount of work for climate, rather than fear what might be done to it itself. So I think there is a sense in which the land use sector needs to be empowered to take on board what it can do in terms of delivering on the climate, as well as what we might be asking various sectors to do when it comes to non-financial reporting or the taxonomy. And again, I will just repeat before I give you back the floor and listen to your comments and questions, that really this is an opportunity as well as a big challenge. And I believe that we have heard too little from what is actually happening at farm level around changing in land use practices, around science and innovation, around reducing inputs but holding production to current levels. And we need to hear more of that, because I think it would also give confidence to farmers who are not on that journey to realize that this isn't just a threat. In fact, I believe it's not a threat. What it is an opportunity to be more resilient for the future, because we know that farmers, while there are emissions which contribute to climate change, you are equally affected by climate change in some really drastic ways, whether it's droughts or floods or crop damage or whatever. So look, I hope I've painted a picture of where we are at in the Commission. I look forward now to your questions and indeed your comments, and I hope we'll have a good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Commissioner McGuinness, for I think those very clear views you have on the path forward, and potentially also on eliminating some of the concerns that are still very much alive. I would say in the agricultural community, in the agri-food community, but also given the participants from other sectors having similar concerns on their own activities. There's a couple of questions coming in, maybe just because we might not have the opportunity to tackle it at the next round of questions. When you speak about the transitional dimension and transitional activities, and you clearly refer to, of course, the work you have commissioned to the platform on sustainable finance, I think it's striking for some to see quite some very clear sort of considered to be transitional activities, not necessary to be included at this stage, such as natural gas, for example. There's a consideration of why that is the case. And as you've indicated, of course, that this is subject to potential changes. Would be interesting to have your insights. I also take the two questions that we have for the time being in the chat. One is related very specifically to, of course, the fact, how is the relation between the internal taxonomy rules that we're establishing and evidently the relation with third countries, for example? How does that affect, of course, the markets, I would say, at EU level? How is that taken into account? The example was given of sugar and the production that is coming from beyond the EU, and that is indeed, how is that considered in the context of the delegated act? And another question is related, if I just read it out very briefly here, on the relation between the different methodologies, the assessment of the methodology of taxonomy, and then other reporting initiatives, such as the substantiating green claims, for example. Let me start by taking those two, because I do want to make sure that we have sufficient time for Pekka Pesonen and also for Christine Ribera afterwards for their contributions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. There's an awful lot to answer there, so I'm going to try my best and come back to me if I fail, because I'm quite happy for you to challenge me. Let me talk about markets. So in my past life as a member of the European Parliament, I lived through the demise of the sugar industry in the member state I know best. And clearly when I talk to farmers groups, there is always this question of the imports and standards and demands made internally and externally. So a few points. One is that, of course, we are net exporters of food in the European Union. And of course, there are sectoral issues which cause particular concerns, whether it's sugar or indeed beef. The second point is that the European Union is leading globally. Whether we like this or not, this is a fact. We have committed ourselves to a very high achievement. And perhaps we do it from the point of view that if we don't, then there is no future for anyone. And I think sometimes that's a dramatic statement, but it's also the truth. So it may not affect me, but it will affect my children and their grandchildren. So there is this long-termism required. And we hope and believe that when the rest of the world is moving, and I believe it will, that these issues around level playing fields, because I think that's the core point, will be less difficult than they are. We do talk about a carbon border adjustment mechanism. There's really not flesh on the bones of that just yet, but it is one way perhaps of tackling the concerns that are, I think, part of your question. So really when I speak to groups, they say, so if Europe does this work around climate and we're a very small part of the overall problem, what is the point? And in fact, I reverse that and say, it would be shocking if Europe did nothing, because we have the wherewithal to do something. And the truth is that, and I look in the mirror myself, many of our ways of living and producing have not been sustainable. So therefore, I take the point that you make because I understand it very well, but I don't see it as either an excuse to go slower. But I do think it should give us strength to do more globally, which is why we have been involved in the international platform. And, you know, when I look at New Zealand, and I would read a lot of research coming from there, there's an awful lot of work there around emissions and water quality. They're dealing with the very same issues that Europe is, and the demands made by citizens are similar to the ones that we will be facing here. In relation to gas, I mean, this is, I suppose, a tricky one. There are lots of questions around gas. The first thing is that in the level 1 legislation, the definition of transition is quite tight. So it does constrain us around what we can actually do. Companies themselves can provide plans to, if you like, to knit themselves into the taxonomy if they feel that that is possible. And in relation to gas generally, there are in many member states, fossil fuel is the only fuel, and to make a leap to renewables is not quite as easy as it is to write that change. So there will be a need for a gas in transition. There are different views about this as to thresholds, and it's quite a technical and scientific area. But I think we all realize that to make the journey, we will need a transition. It's how we deal with it. Because what is, I think, a real concern is if you invest today in a gas plant, for example, or even a bio plant, but particularly in a gas facility, and this becomes, if you like, a stranded asset in a very short number of years, then it's not a wise investment. So it's really, how do we plan for the long term while dealing with short-term concerns? And I think you've raised 3 of them in what you've said there. So I hope I've answered some of your points, Vicky. I'll hand back the microphone to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to respond to many questions in a very succinct and very clear way. Without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Pekka Pesonen, which needs no introduction, Secretary General of COPA-COGECA. I would say the floor is yours to also indicate your views and considerations with regard to agriculture in the context of taxonomy. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vicky, and I hope that you can hear me. First of all, I would like to thank CEFS and Maria Cristina, our longtime colleague, for the kind invitation and especially taking part with our longtime, I should say, ally in the European Parliament, Mrs McGuinness. Congratulations once again to your nomination as Commissioner. Of course, ensuring finance is of paramount importance, especially under the new circumstances created by the recent COVID pandemic, where agriculture and forestry need to recover from the current crisis while continuing their transition towards more resource-efficient, innovative and competitive economy. Contrary to, Commissioner, your own claim, I would claim that European farming model is amongst the most advanced farming systems in the world. Also, Europe is the only continent where the forestry cover and the carbon stock actually increases. So we have a very good track record, and we need to cherish this and actually make it work even better. In fact, our agriculture and forestry sectors have decoupled environmental impact from production growth, a trend which should continue. We need to facilitate a science-based transition towards even more competitive, low-carbon agricultural systems that meet the challenges of climate change and that follow a logic of sustainable growth, considering environmental, economic, and social issues. And in fact, the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the Commissioner you pointed out is one of the elements that we have supported. And we supported also the European Parliament recent initiative to come up with the analysis on market-based carbon crediting scheme for agriculture. But while we do that, we recognize that we need to produce food as a main source of our justification for the European tax base in particular. But EU agriculture is already behind other sectors in its investment, and we need to correct this for agriculture and sustainability needs. In agriculture, we have a strong, globally unique sustainability framework under various sectorial regulations, of which, of course, the CAP is by far the most important. Introducing another layer of rules and criteria on top of this is simply not realistic. We really don't like this, and we don't see any justification to it. It would bring additional burden of red tape to the operators and member states. This we cannot accept, in particular when we all aim at reducing administrative burdens to our economy. The EU Green Deal has clear objectives for a more sustainable and resilient farming sector. We support this initiative, but it's more to do with how rather than if. We consider inconceivable that new horizontal legislation applicable to sustainable investment sets additional new sustainability standards for agricultural production. Let me underline that we in COPA-COGECA, and I believe that most of my colleagues here today would support this, we are committed to all relevant common policies, including the CAP and its sustainability initiatives. We also support active forest management with all its dimensions, especially on sustainability. Let me also underline that the current MFF foresees a real-term cut to the EU agriculture expenditure, even with the famous 7.5 billion next generation allocation. In short, this would call for more economic returns from the market to attract new farmers to our sector to earn a living, and not just to make a way of life. Increasing cost of finance does not fit into this picture, does it? The first draft of the Delegated Act had elements that go well beyond the current European agricultural and forestry practices and standards. The Commission is arguing against any comprehensive impact assessment on taxonomy. One of the Commission main assuring arguments has been the voluntary nature of the initiative, like the Commissioner, you said it. But in real life, we have already seen implementation of this voluntary initiative by major financial institutions, banks that are involved with agriculture and forestry. As we speak, they simply greenwash their portfolios to get off the hook. You can double check this from some of the big operators, even here in Europe. And they push the burden of proof down the chain. Therefore, we must investigate the whole chain, not only some stakeholders alone. You said several times that this is not imposing anything on farmers or foresters, but this is the real life. This is what's happening already as we speak. Voluntary requirement of a financial institution very quickly translates into concrete action through traders, processors, and other operators. And we have evidence, plenty of evidence of this already. Even some of these big players say this publicly, that we help, as they say, we help how farmers can become more sustainable. And I'm afraid this help is already in the pipeline. Do we really expect that this remains voluntary initiative when it lands on the doorsteps of millions of farmers and foresters with little negotiation powers? And do we really expect that they will get a fair remuneration for their efforts at the time of crisis like we have had now, especially in COVID-19? We must underline that this new voluntary sustainability criteria will have a strong influence on the EU future legislation. And please consider also, knowing your substantial, strong background in the CAP, that the current CAP actually talks about a delivery model that the member states are supposed to put in place, taking into account all sorts of initiatives and objectives. And so if this is not sufficient, and we have to go still beyond this, so if this is not good enough, this is exactly the argument that we put forward, that this would set another layer of complexities. You said yourself that we see this spreading to other legal initiatives of the Union, one of which is InvestEU. I think you mentioned that. One element that we are interested is EU methane strategy, new EU circular economy action plan, and even the new sustainability competition tool mentioned, the taxonomy in this public consultation. In preparing its policy on the environment, the Union shall take account environmental conditions in the various regions of the Union, the economic and social development of the Union as a whole, and the balanced development of its regions. If taxonomy becomes an active EU tool, the Article 191 of the treaty will not be respected. We have stressed on several occasions that the recommendations that are included in the first delegated act derive from the work of the technical expert group that lacked technical and legislative knowledge of the agriculture and forestry sectors. This is a fact. This is not an opinion. There were no experts from the sectors. We also regret the same lack of representativeness in the platform for sustainable finance. The consultation for such a complex file was open only for 4 weeks for the first delegated act, and the discussions on the next delegated acts will start with 1.5-hour meeting this week to discuss 4 delegated acts in areas such as biodiversity, water, circular economy, and pollution. And you could count how many minutes per each of these topics we would have. We must have proper discussion in these criteria, and we must learn from the outcome of the first delegated act. But make no mistake, we are interested and committed to work for a more sustainable future for our sectors. But this work must be done with the involvement of the stakeholders that are supposed to put this in practice in their own livelihoods. and not alone with the representatives whose only motivation seems to be making negative headlines of European agriculture and forestry. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Pesonen, for these very clear messages to the Commissioner. If you will, Commissioner, I would like to give the floor now immediately to Marie-Christine Ribera, the Director General of CEFS, and then, of course, allow for you to comment on both interventions. Marie-Christine, please.
Madame la députée européenne, Christophe, chère Madame Sander, dear Commissioner McGuinness, dear Becca, dear participants, my first words are for you, Madam Commissioner and team. Thank you for your openness to dialogue and pedagogy on the matter. More than 200 years ago, an EU sugar industry based on homegrown sugar beets was started from scratch. Do you know why? Food security, independence of supply, playing a strategic role supported by strong political will. This is not a given. COVID-19 is reminding us of it. Men and women who firmly believed in progress, innovation, and science made it happen. Today, as you pointed out, we have to take up a major and urgent challenge, mitigating and adapting to climate change, reaching carbon neutrality, untapping the potential for bio-based product, making a green economy happen. We equally want to make this happen, as Becca just said. And this is obviously not about sponsoring niche markets. This is about incentivizing as many economic actors and people as possible to engage and deliver on larger scales. In the real economy, we can press a key like in a video game and be instantly transported into a virtual world of dreams or climb the Everest without proper equipment. We did a lot already in our sector, reaching 51% reduction of CO2 emissions over the last 30 years. But this is not enough. And we all know that getting additional percentages of reduction will be hard to get and out of reach without huge financial support to invest in cleaner technologies and without a well-calibrated transition pathway. You mentioned it yourself. So green financing under your leadership, Madam Commissioner, is a very powerful tool to channel money towards such investments. Taxonomy, at its backbone, is certainly useful to get transparent and comparable information for investors. Sustainability, circular economy, no waste activities have always been our daily endeavors in our sector, where a use is found for every part of the beet. How? Well, out of the same hectare of sugar beet, which is a carbon sink, crop grown in rotations, we produce sugar and pulp for feed and paper maybe, and alcohol for perfume, bioethanol, disinfectant, and biogas and electricity and water that we take from the beet, full of water, and molasses of juices from the fermentation, chemical, and pharmaceutical industry, and so on. So why considering unsustainable for taxonomy purposes large parts of the EU bioeconomy, such as bioplastics or organic chemistry? Why setting criteria prohibiting food and feed crops from being used as bio-based feedstock for manufacture? On which scientific basis? Why should now taxonomy discriminate between the sustainable biofuels already recognized by RED II as sustainable, as is the case of European renewable ethanol, which saves more than 70% greenhouse gas emissions compared to fossil fuels? So what I'm saying here, and the question I'm asking, are obviously valid for many other sectors and activities within agriculture and beyond. And together with my colleagues from the European Bioeconomy Alliance, gathering no less than 12 leading EU organizations representing sectors and about 4,500 companies active in bioeconomy, with my colleagues in the primary food processors, the vital link between agriculture and second processing, the EU biofuel chain, working hard on decarbonization in transport, our newly born platform Agriculture in Progress, the Renewable Carbon Initiative. I can, quote a lot of other people. I think they could all give you similar and additional examples of the point I just made. So we need a well-calibrated transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marie-Christine, for your comments. Commissioner, mindful of the time and your specific cutoff at 6 o'clock, the floor is yours to reply to some of the comments and questions raised by Mr Pesonen and Marie-Christine Rivera.
Well, firstly, I want to say thank you very much, because I mean, I have huge regard for Pekka. I know him a long time, so it's really important for me to hear his very clear concerns around taxonomy, and I've made good note of them. We have meetings at the end of this week, and I certainly will raise those concerns. However, one of the points you made, Pekka, and I think just to pick up on it, about this investigating the whole chain. In my view, this is exactly what we have to do, not just in agriculture, but in all sectors, that we need to look not just in a linear fashion, but in a circular fashion with all of the inputs. So if you're a farmer, a dairy farmer, where is your feed coming from? You know, there are questions around deforestation and soya, etc. So, I mean, we all know the challenges that we face. And what I tried to get across in my presentation is that we would all rather that we didn't have to change and that the status quo could prevail, but the truth is otherwise. And therefore the questions that you ask me and the question I need to answer when we finally decide on the delegated act is, what role for agriculture? Some have suggested that it should be removed completely from the taxonomy, but that is not my view. I think that would be a disservice to agriculture, because I think it's part of the solution. So that's my first comment in relation to this need to investigate the entire chain. And I've said this to individual farmer organizations and groups, and it's a good management strategy anyway to see what is actually workable in the medium to long term. Because we do know that with some inputs that they will not be around, so therefore we need to look at other management practices. I am concerned when you say that the banks, the financial institutions will be involved in greenwashing their portfolios to get off the hook. Well, if our legislation works properly, they will be on the hook for greenwashing rather than getting off the hook by trying to greenwash. Now, I know that's a big ask and it's quite a statement for me to make, but I do have a sense in which maybe for the first time ever that the commitment towards action is real, as opposed to wanting nice words in an annual report. And it's real because if you don't address climate risks, whether you're a bank or an insurance company or a manufacturer, whatever you do, that your investment can go sour, so that there's an economic imperative as well as an ethical imperative, but there's an economic imperative for these financial institutions to look at what they're doing and not to settle for greenwash. But equally from our side on the non-financial reporting directive, we're having a lot of discussions as to how you validate what companies claim. Because I think when it comes to farmers, they have to validate what they do in some of the eco schemes. So we need to have this validation. How do we do it to make it workable rather than cumbersome? These are all very, very difficult questions. But I get a very strong sense from you, Pekka, and you've done a good job about the perhaps anger amongst the land use sector around the taxonomy. You mentioned in particular that the expertise wasn't there. I didn't get the input. I can't account for the past. I can only account for my role here now. My understanding was there was a limitation on numbers and that you should have been able to feed in your expertise, but certainly you're doing it now. So I very much appreciate that. You mentioned fair remuneration, and I have fought many years in the European Parliament to raise the issue of the lack of decent remuneration for production of food. And before I transferred to this building, I had conversations with lead commissioners saying this very point, that if you want farmers to change, to be more sustainable, then you have to stop cutting the price that they get for, or really the return they get for their work, to the very core. And sadly, that is not happening. You know that I worked on the unfair trading practices. It's a very first step. Some member states are implementing, not all are yet, but at least it opened this idea that food cannot be cheap. And if food is cheap, then you put pressure back on the production system. And how can you expect all of the deliverables around public goods and sustainability if the model is around cheap food? And I think it's a big question that we need to discuss here internally as well as externally. And I do that in my new role here. On the methane strategy, one of the last things I did in the Parliament was around methane. I looked that we would have a hearing, and my colleagues here with me, there will be a hearing in the Parliament on methane, and I think that's hugely important to get it in perspective. And what I get clearly from both Mary-Christina and Pekka is a sense in which farmers feel alienated from this discussion, that they feel they're being told what to do. And indeed, that is the sense that I get from the farmers that I know well, that they do have this sense that they are being, if you like, accused, and they feel in the wrong for climate damage, and that their contribution is not being properly acknowledged or even assessed. I have made the point privately and publicly that if we want farmers to change and reorientate, we have to encourage and change how we approach this issue. So I'm sympathetic to the voice that you raise here around it. And frankly, you will not get people to change by trying to force them. You will only get people to come on this journey if we show that there is a value in the longer term for them to do that, and that we understand the concerns of the land use sector, and we try and, as Pekka mentioned, show the opportunities for carbon-rich soils, for a market in carbon. And I think the reason why there's such anxiety is because we're in this incredible state of flux. We know that there is much demands being made. I mean, the aluminium sector, the housing sector, every single sector have been in touch with us about the taxonomy, and very few are happy because it involves change. But does that mean that we should stop doing what we're doing? And I would be interested, Pekka, maybe if you have a moment to come back on some of those points. Do you think that agriculture should be in the taxonomy or not? That would be interesting, or indeed forestry, because these are discussions that we're having here. So I suppose what I'd like to say, and it was really good to hear the evolution of the sugar sector and why it evolved, and food security is hugely important. I think if we can look in the long term, I mean, food security will only be a reality if we mind the very things that give us good quality food, which is soil, water, and air, and the inputs that go to it. I know there's lots of chat, and I'm going to take note of the questions. We won't be able to answer them all now, but there's people asking about gene editing and new technologies, and these are, issues that we need to discuss. But at the very core, we will not have a sustainable food system if we don't have the protections around the basic ingredients of how you produce quality food. And that's what a lot of the work around both biodiversity strategy, farm to fork, and taxonomy and CAP. But I do accept that for farmers looking in and they see this list of different things, a new CAP, all of these things, it does become quite maybe an anxious moment where they wonder, where do they fit into all of this? But I get the same response from the larger corporates around non-financial reporting, disclosure regulation. All of these things are equally difficult and tricky for them, but I don't dismiss its impact at farm level. So finally, just to give you the floor back to maybe come back to me on some points, that this is not to punish, and I think Anne Sander made that very point, that it should not be to punish, and I would hate to be involved in any piece of legislation that was about punishment unless it was to punish those who are guilty of something. In my view, this is about a fundamental change across all sections of society and activities, but we need farmers to be with us on the journey. We will not make the change without your engagement. And therefore, I would really value how you think that might happen. And I certainly will take your words and your input from today's event very much to the discussions that we will have, as I said, later this week and into next week. So perhaps back to you, Vicky, for some responses. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very, very much. There's indeed a number of things coming through in the chat, as you've very correctly noticed, Commissioner McGuinness. Also with relation to biofuels, why is biomass transitional, only considered as transitional, etc. I have questions about forestry, some really again about the interaction between existing legislation, RED II, biofuels, and of course taxonomy, the new definitions that seemingly appear for forestry management in taxonomy. So again, I fully understand that you cannot and do not have the opportunity and time to go into all of that. As indicated to all the participants, we will group this and of course, with your kind permission, revert back to you. If I may, and seeing that it is exactly 3 minutes to 6, if you would allow, perhaps I just pass the floor back to Marie-Christine, who of course in terms of CFS is hosting this webinar, perhaps for some concluding remarks before you leave us, Commissioner.
Yes, I'll be very quick. I would say, looking at all the questions, your replies, Commissioner, the comments from Becca, I would say that this webinar, in our view, is a kind of starting point for further work and exchange with the Commission to feed into the discussions. To do so, why not a white book, including concrete examples from many sectors to be shared with your services, hopefully with your support in the near future, to eventually reconcile the virtual economy with the real economy. That would be my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, a very big thank you, I think, Commissioner McGuinness, for having taken the time to have this exchange of views. Again, a very warm thank you to, of course, MEP and Sander for also joining and the opening statements and supporting this webinar and the topic at hand, which is of key importance to the agriculture, agri-food sector, but well beyond. Thank you very much to Mr Pesonen and also for your very interesting observations, comments, questions, and of course Marie-Christine Ribera, thank you for of course hosting, I think, this webinar, and for putting the perspective of a future and continued cooperation on this important topic with the Commission and beyond. Do you have any concluding remarks, Commissioner? Please go ahead.
My first comment is a big thank you, but secondly, could you capture the questions so that they can be sent to us, because they will feed into our deliberations here, and to thank my former colleague and friend Anne Sander for bringing us together, because it is important to have these discussions and to hear one another out and be very clear with one another. And finally, to say that this is a journey and a difficult one. But there's also opportunities there. So I would hate to think that people see this only as a problem, because it's not only a problem. And I think many farmers know themselves when they're reaching the limits on their own land, when the pushback comes. So I think if we can work together, we will certainly be stronger and better. And I hope that today's and this evening's exchange shows you how understanding I am of your concerns and willing to find solutions that will deliver on all of our objectives. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Commissioner, and we reassure the participants all the questions have been taken on board and will definitely be transferred to you and your team, Commissioner. Thank you very much. I think this concludes the webinar. Thank you for your active participation, for the questions in the chat, and this is a story indeed to be continued. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the next occasion for exchange. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.